Welcome to Whispers in the Dark. Picture this, a chilling whisper in the woods, a creature with glowing eyes watching you from the shadows. As the darkness creeps in, you realize you're not alone. But the terrifying part, it's already inside your home. The Whistling Man, the Appalachian Mountains. A range so steeped in mystery, draped in mist, that it seems to whisper secrets older than the earth itself. The trees, their trunks gnarled and twisted like the hands of the dead, reach toward the heavens, their shadows casting eerie patterns upon the ground. A place of such isolation that, in its quiet, the mountains themselves seem to hold their breath, watching and waiting for something or someone. This is where our story begins, where fear waits at the edge of every forgotten trail and the past never truly stays buried. The Appalachian Mountains, an endless expanse of dense forest and craggy peaks, have long been home to many stories, tales spun by those who dared to traverse its wild, untamed beauty. Among those tales, there is one that stands out above the rest. A story whispered from generation to generation, of a man who wandered too deep into the woods and became lost, not just physically, but in a way far more terrifying. It's a story of the Whistling Man, a creature that may not even be human, who haunts the woods, seeking those foolish enough to cross its path. Our story begins with Ethan, a young man who found himself drawn to the Appalachian region. He had heard the stories, of course. Who hasn't? But he dismissed them, believing them to be mere legends, born of superstition and old fear. That was until he decided to venture into the wilderness, a decision that would prove to be both a mistake and his undoing. It was early autumn when Ethan, an avid photographer with a passion for capturing the raw beauty of nature, arrived in the small town of Green Hollow, nestled at the base of the mountains. Green Hollow was one of those places that most outsiders passed by without a second thought, small, sleepy, and forgotten by time. The kind of town where nothing ever seemed to happen. That is, until the night the Whistling Man came. Ethan had rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town, a cozy wooden structure that overlooked the dense forest. The air was cool, crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the quiet was both soothing and oppressive. There were no street lights, no bustling shops, just the deep hum of the wilderness, the occasional rustle of a deer or the distant call of a coyote. At first, the peace was comforting. Ethan spent his days hiking along the trails, snapping photographs of the autumn leaves that had just begun to change color. He was alone, but the solitude didn't bother him. He relished in it. The thought that something dark might be lurking in the woods never crossed his mind. After all, those were just stories, right? It wasn't until his third night in the cabin that things began to change. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the mountain air grew colder, Ethan sat on the porch with a warm cup of coffee, admiring the stars that began to pepper the sky. The wind picked up, whispering through the trees, and the first thing he noticed was the stillness, an almost unnatural silence that settled over the woods. The night seemed too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you uneasy. Then he heard it, a sound faint at first as though carried on the wind but growing louder. A soft melodic tune, a whistle slow and steady, rising and falling like a ghostly lullaby. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the kind of whistle one might expect from an animal or even a person, but something else entirely. A sharp, eerie sound, hollow and empty. For a moment, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks on him. But no, there it was again. A whistle, clearer this time, closer. He stood up, a shiver running down his spine. The air felt different now, charged, thick with an unseen presence. He walked to the edge of the porch, his eyes scanning the darkened woods, but saw nothing. Just shadows, stretching long and thin beneath the towering trees. Probably just some local out for a walk. Ethan muttered to himself, trying to dismiss the growing sense of unease that settled deep in his chest. He returned to his chair, but as he sat back down, the whistle came again. This time it was louder and closer. Ethan's pulse quickened. He had read about strange occurrences in the mountains, stories of things that lurked in the woods, of strange noises and things that moved where they shouldn't. He had even laughed it off when the townspeople had warned him not to venture too far into the forest. "You'll hear things out there," they said with knowing looks, "but you best not pay them any mind." But now, as the whistle echoed again, his curiosity got the better of him. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped off the porch, the beam slicing through the darkness like a knife. He called out, "Hello, anyone out there?" The only response was the wind now howling through the trees, and then there it was again, the whistle, closer. So close, in fact, that it felt as though it was right behind him. Ethan's breath hitched, his skin prickling with cold sweat. He turned quickly, his flashlight dancing across the forest floor, but again he saw nothing. The forest was still, but the whistle didn't stop. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to turn and run, but he didn't. He couldn't. Something was drawing him forward, an invisible force, a pull that he couldn't explain. He stepped deeper into the woods, the trees closing in around him like the jaws of some great beast. The whistle came again, and this time it was accompanied by a low, guttural growl, a sound unlike any animal he had ever heard. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet gave way, and he stumbled forward, landing hard on his knees. As he looked up, his flashlight caught something in the distance, a figure, tall and thin, standing motionless among the trees. Its features were blurred, indistinct, but Ethan could make out the outline of something dark and towering, with eyes that glowed like embers in the night. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, as though it were not quite human. Its mouth opened, and the whistle came again, louder, sharper, a sound that cut through the very air itself. Ethan's heart raced. The whistle was coming from it, this thing standing in the dark, watching him. The whistle, the growl, the eyes that burned with malevolent intent, it was all part of it. The whistling man. He froze, terror locking his muscles in place. For a long moment the creature and Ethan stood locked in a silent standoff, neither one moving. Then the creature did something that would haunt Ethan for the rest of his life. It smiled, a grotesque, twisted smile as wide as its face, stretching unnaturally. And then with a sudden lurch it moved toward him. Ethan didn't know how he found the strength to run, but he did. His legs carried him back toward the cabin, his breath ragged, his mind a blur. The whistling man was behind him, the whistle growing louder. The creature's eerie smile burned into his memory. He burst through the door, slamming it shut behind him, and locked it with shaking hands. The whistle stopped, but the growl, low and rumbling, continued, coming from somewhere outside the cabin. Ethan pressed his back to the door, his heart hammering in his chest. He never went back out there. The next morning, when he left the cabin to return to town, the woods were quiet, too quiet. The townspeople didn't ask him about his experience, and he didn't tell them. He didn't need to. They already knew. They knew about the whistling man, and now so did he. But the question that lingered in Ethan's mind as he drove away was this: what happens when the whistling man gets too close? Does he take you, or does he simply watch, waiting for the next whistle? And the last thought that crossed his mind as the cabin disappeared from view, he could still hear the whistle, faint but unmistakable, the whistling man. Ben had never believed in the stories. Not really. Sure, he had heard the legends, tales of strange creatures, ghosts in the mist, and shadowy figures that haunted the Appalachian wilderness, but those were just stories. Myths passed down by locals to make the woods seem more mysterious, more dangerous. He didn't buy into it, not even for a second. He was in his early 20s, filled with that naive confidence that comes with being young and invincible, convinced that nothing could touch him. Ben had grown up in the suburbs, far from the wilderness, where his life had been wrapped in the safety of routine and predictability. The loudest noise he heard on a typical day was the hum of city traffic. The only shadows that stretched across his path were the ones cast by tall buildings, not the ones lurking in the deep corners of dark forests. So when he and his friends decided to go on a hiking trip to the Appalachian Mountains, he saw it as nothing more than an adventure, a chance to get away from the chaos of daily life and find some peace in nature. The idea of danger was a distant thought, one that was as abstract as the legends that filled the air around the campfire. But that first night in the woods, as Ben sat on the edge of a rocky outcrop, staring out over the vast, dark expanse of the forest, a strange unease began to settle over him. The group had hiked all day, breathing in the crisp mountain air and marveling at the beauty of their surroundings. The sun had set hours ago, leaving only the glow of their campfire and the flickering stars above. The wind was gentle, a soft whisper through the trees, but beneath it there was something else, a stillness, a quiet that felt too complete, too unnatural. The sounds of the forest seemed muted, swallowed by the vastness of the night. There were no rustling leaves, no nocturnal animals scurrying in the underbrush. The world felt frozen in time, as though the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Ben stretched out his legs and leaned back against the trunk of a nearby tree, his friends laughing and talking around the fire. He took a deep breath, letting the cool mountain air fill his lungs, and then, on a whim, he did it. He whistled. The sound was sharp, clear, cutting through the quiet of the night like a blade through still water. A brief, almost playful sound, but as soon as the final note left his lips, a strange tension settled in. The campfire flickered, casting long, shuddering shadows across the clearing. Ben glanced around at his friends, who had all stopped talking. "What was that?" one of them asked, eyes darting nervously around the camp. Ben shrugged, the tension in his shoulders easing. "It was just me," he said with a grin. "You guys are too jumpy." But even as he spoke, something about the air had changed. It wasn't just the unsettling silence, it was the feeling of being watched. Ben couldn't shake the sensation that there was something in the woods, something staring at him, unseen. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled, and he instinctively looked over his shoulder, but there was nothing, only the endless, dark forest stretching out beyond the firelight. He laughed it off, trying to shrug away the unease that crept up his spine. "I think I'm just tired," he said, pushing himself up from the ground and heading toward the tent. As he lay in the dark, trying to sleep, the sound of the wind outside rustling the leaves became a backdrop to the quiet pounding of his heart. The chill of the night crept through the fabric of the tent, and Ben shifted restlessly, staring into the blackness. He should have felt safe here, surrounded by friends, out in the open, in the embrace of nature. But instead there was an unsettling feeling that wouldn't leave, gnawing at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. Then it came again. The whistle. Faint at first, so distant that he almost convinced himself it was part of the night's sounds. The wind, the trees. But no, it was deliberate. A low, eerie melody drifting through the darkness, wrapping itself around his mind. Ben sat up quickly, his heart racing, and for a moment he wasn't sure if he had imagined it. The whistle had been almost mocking, a sound that didn't belong in the peaceful silence of the mountains. He crept out of the tent, pulling his jacket tightly around his shoulders as the cold night air hit him. The fire was dying now, reduced to embers, casting dim, flickering light across the clearing. The others were still asleep, unaware of the strange sound that had unsettled Ben. He stood there for a moment, listening, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. Then he heard it again, clearer this time, closer. The whistle echoing through the trees. Ben's breath caught in his throat. He scanned the dark edges of the forest, his flashlight trembling in his hand as he swept the beam across the trees. Nothing. The silence that followed was even more unsettling than the whistle itself. His heart thudded in his chest, and for a moment he wondered if he had just imagined it. But then there was movement, a shape. A figure, tall and unnaturally still, standing just beyond the reach of the firelight just at the edge of the clearing. Ben's eyes locked on the figure, his body frozen in place. It was too dark to make out any details, but the figure's shape was wrong, too tall, too thin. The way it stood, perfectly still, as though waiting for something. The whistle came again, soft and low, like a call from the depths of the woods, drawing Ben's gaze. Before he could react, the figure moved. It didn't walk, it seemed to glide, its limbs bending at unnatural angles as it came closer. The air grew thick, heavy, as though something was pressing down on him. Ben couldn't move, couldn't look away. The whistle was all around him now, surrounding him, growing louder and louder. The sound was no longer a song, it was a warning. Suddenly, the figure's face became clear, illuminated by the dying light of the fire. It was twisted, contorted, something that shouldn't be human. Its eyes were wide and hollow, black voids in a face that was almost elongated, stretched. And the mouth, it stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth, like a predator's grin. Ben's body finally responded, adrenaline coursing through his veins as he turned and ran. He could hear the whistle behind him, the creature's feet scraping against the ground, the air growing colder with each step. He didn't look back, but he knew it was there. He could feel it closing in just behind him, a presence that was hungry. The world around him blurred, the sounds of the night turning to a cacophony as his feet pounded against the ground. He didn't know how long he ran, minutes, hours. His lungs burned, his heart thundered in his chest, but he couldn't stop. And still the whistle followed him, always a step behind. Finally, he reached the edge of the camp, and without a second thought, he dove into the safety of the tent, zipping it shut with shaking hands. His friends stirred, mumbling in their sleep, unaware of the nightmare that had just chased him through the woods. Ben lay there, breathless, staring into the blackness of the tent, still hearing that whistle echoing in his mind. He couldn't explain what had happened. He couldn't rationalize the figure, the whistle, the face that still haunted his thoughts. But he knew one thing for certain: whatever it was real. And it was out there waiting for the next whistle. As Ben lay there in the dark, fear pressing down on him, one thought kept circling in his mind: what happens when it gets too close? And just as he thought the night might offer him some peace, a new sound echoed through the still air, faint, almost drowned by the night wind. The whistle, and it was closer than ever. The lost souls of Crater Ridge. The air was thick with the scent of pine as Sarah stood on the edge of Crater Ridge, looking out over the valley below. The setting sun bathed the landscape in golden light, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. It was beautiful, serene, almost too perfect. The kind of beauty that made you forget how much darkness lay hidden beneath the surface. Sarah had always loved the outdoors, the freedom it brought, and the sense of adventure. So when her boyfriend, Alex, suggested a weekend getaway to Crater Ridge, she eagerly agreed. The rugged, untamed wilderness was the perfect escape from their busy lives in the city. What they didn't know, however, was that the mountain held secrets far darker than they could have ever imagined. Crater Ridge had a history, one that the locals didn't like to talk about. It wasn't the kind of place tourists flocked to, despite its breathtaking views. A quiet, almost forgotten ridge, it had been the site of a bloody skirmish during the Civil War, where soldiers from both sides had lost their lives. Many of them had never been properly buried, their bodies left to rot in the harsh conditions of the wilderness. At first, Sarah and Alex didn't think much of the history. To them, it was just another story, a relic of the past, something that could easily be dismissed. But as the evening drew near, the air grew heavier, and the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch longer, darker. They had decided to set up camp near an old, abandoned military outpost, a place where, according to local lore, soldiers had made their final stand. The structures were long gone, reduced to crumbling foundations and rusted remnants of forgotten equipment, but the eerie silence that surrounded the area felt almost oppressive. As Sarah and Alex built their campfire, the remnants of the past seemed to whisper through the wind. "Hey, let's take a walk before it gets too dark," Alex suggested, his voice filled with the excitement of the adventure. Sarah hesitated. The atmosphere felt off, a strange weight in the air that she couldn't quite shake. But Alex's enthusiasm was infectious, and soon enough they were trekking down a narrow path that wound through the dense trees. The further they went, the quieter the forest became, until the only sounds were the crunching of leaves beneath their feet and the occasional rustle of branches overhead. As they walked, Sarah couldn't help but notice something strange about the path they were on. It seemed to wind in a way that didn't make sense, like they were being led somewhere, almost as if the forest itself was guiding them. The deeper they went into the woods, the more the feeling of being watched crept over Sarah. It was a sensation she couldn't explain, but it was enough to make her heart beat a little faster. Then, without warning, Alex stopped in his tracks. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Sarah's blood ran cold. She strained her ears, but all she could hear was the wind. There was nothing but the rustle of leaves and the occasional distant call of an owl. Still, something about the silence felt wrong. "Probably just the wind," Sarah replied, though her voice faltered. But Alex didn't seem convinced. He looked toward a dense thicket of trees on the far side of the clearing. For a moment, Sarah thought she saw something, movement, a shadow flitting between the trees. She blinked, and when she looked again, it was gone. "I don't know, Sarah," Alex said, his voice tight. "Let's go back to the camp. This place, it feels off." They turned around, but as they did, the distant sound of a whistle pierced the stillness. It was faint at first, like the wind carrying a far-off tune, but it grew louder, clearer, until it felt as if the very air around them had become saturated with it. A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine. The whistle was haunting, a mournful sound that echoed through the trees, drawing them in like a siren's call. She felt a sudden compulsion to follow it, to go toward it, as though something deep within her had awoken and was urging her forward. "Sarah, what's wrong?" Alex's voice broke through her thoughts, but his words sounded muffled, distant, as though they came from underwater. Before she could respond, Her eyes were drawn to a figure standing in the distance near an old stone foundation. The figure was tall, hunched over, its clothing tattered and torn. Its face, hidden beneath a dark, weathered hat, was obscured in shadow, but Sarah could feel its eyes, cold, empty, watching her. The figure raised its hand, holding a rifle. Its stance was stiff, its movements jerky, as though it were frozen in time. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She blinked, and when she opened her eyes again, the figure was gone, as if it had never been there. "Did you see that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. But Alex had already begun pulling her away, his grip tightening on her arm. "We need to go now," he said, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. They ran, their hearts pounding in their chests as they made their way back toward the camp, the whistle still ringing in their ears. But the further they went, the louder the sound became, filling their heads, drowning out everything else. It was no longer a melody. It was a warning, a cry for help, and it seemed to be coming from all around them. By the time they reached the clearing, the campfire had burned down to nothing but embers, the warmth it once provided now replaced by an unnatural chill. Sarah glanced over her shoulder, expecting to see the dark figure again, but there was nothing. Only the trees, their twisted branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal hands. They sat in silence for a long time, the air thick with the weight of unspoken words. The whistle had stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed them whole, leaving them with nothing but the distant sound of their own breathing. That night, Sarah lay awake in her sleeping bag, her eyes wide open as she listened to the sounds of the forest. The wind howled through the trees, but beneath it she could still hear the faintest echo of the whistle. It was distant now, but it was there, lingering like a ghost from the past. And then it came again, closer this time, cutting through the night air with a sharp, mournful tone. But this time it was followed by something else. A voice, soft at first but growing louder until it was clear as day. "Help us! Help us!" The voice was faint, almost like a whisper carried by the wind, but Sarah recognized it immediately. It was the voice of a soldier, a young man, his words filled with desperation and fear. And as the voice echoed through the woods, Sarah knew, with a terrible certainty, that the spirits of the lost soldiers had come to claim her. The next morning, when Sarah and Alex left Crater Ridge, the forest was silent again. The whistle was gone, the voices were gone, and the only thing left was the memory of what they had experienced, of the lost souls who still roamed the woods, calling out for release from their eternal torment. But Sarah would never forget the whistle, or the face of the soldier she had seen in the distance. And the question that haunted her long after she left the mountains was this: how many souls still linger in the forests of Crater Ridge, waiting for someone to hear their cries? The wolf in the dark. Jack had spent most of his life in the woods. He knew these forests like the back of his weathered hand. The Appalachian wilderness was a place that demanded respect, where even the most seasoned hunters could find themselves outmatched if they weren't careful. But Jack was no ordinary hunter. With over 30 years of experience under his belt, he tracked everything from deer to wild boar and even the occasional mountain lion. He had seen it all, or so he thought. This particular trip had been planned months in advance. A weekend getaway with some of his closest friends, all veteran hunters, into the heart of the Appalachian woods. They had been hunting the same patch of forest for years, and they knew where to find the game, where to camp, and where the dangers lay. The trip was supposed to be a break, a time to reconnect with the wild and to leave behind the burdens of the world for a few days. They had been trekking through the woods for hours, following a narrow trail that wound its way through the dense underbrush. When Jack realized that something was wrong, the path, which was usually well-defined, had started to disappear. The trees were denser, the air thicker, and the sounds of the forest seemed quieter, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. "We're off track," Jack muttered, squinting through the thickening trees. "This doesn't look right." He turned to his friend Ben, who was walking behind him. Ben was younger, eager to prove himself in the woods, but Jack could see the unease in his eyes. "What do you mean?" "This is the way we came last year," Ben said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Last year's path won't do us any good now," Jack replied, checking his map again. The lines of the old forest trail didn't match up with the landmarks around them. "We've strayed off course." Jack had always trusted his instincts in the woods, but now a gnawing sense of uncertainty tugged at him. He could feel something wasn't right. The forest had turned silent, the usual chorus of birds and rustling animals now replaced by a deep, oppressive quiet. It was as though the entire forest had been watching them, waiting for something. "Let's head back," Jack said firmly, his voice low but sure. "We'll find the trail again." But as they turned around, the path behind them seemed to have vanished. The trees were different, taller, darker, as if the forest had changed shape while they weren't looking. Panic began to claw at the edges of his mind, but he pushed it aside. They were seasoned hunters, they could navigate their way out. They'd done it before, they just needed to stay calm. But then they heard it. A low, guttural growl. It started faintly at first, a distant rumble carried on the wind, but as the seconds passed, the growl grew louder, more menacing. The hairs on the back of Jack's neck stood on end. It wasn't the kind of sound made by any animal he knew. It was too deep, too primal, too otherworldly. "What the hell was that?" Ben whispered, his eyes darting nervously around the trees. "I don't know," Jack muttered, his heart racing. "But we need to get out of here. Now." They started walking faster, but the growl grew louder still, now joined by the sound of heavy breathing, ragged and thick, like something was following them just beyond their sight. The forest had gone deathly still. The wind had stopped and the world seemed to hold its breath. Jack's pulse quickened. He knew they were being hunted. Something was tracking them, something with intelligence, something that could sense their every movement. And then, out of the corner of his eye, Jack saw it. A shadow, shifting in the trees, its form barely visible but unmistakable. A hulking shape, too large to be a deer, too sleek to be a bear. It moved with unnatural speed, slipping through the trees like a phantom. "Ben," Jack hissed, his voice tight with fear. "Get ready. Whatever that is, it's coming for us." Before Ben could respond, the figure emerged from the darkness. It was huge, at least 7 feet tall, its fur a dark, matted mass that blended seamlessly with the night. The creature's eyes glowed with an eerie amber light, and its massive, elongated limbs moved with unnatural grace. Its head was too large for its body, its snout too long, the features twisted and bestial. It was a wolf, but not just any wolf. This was something else, something more. The creature let out a bone-chilling howl that seemed to shake the very air around them. Ben froze in place, his breath catching in his throat, but Jack knew better than to stand still. He reached for his rifle, his hands shaking, but before he could even raise it, the creature lunged. The force of the impact sent Jack crashing to the ground, his rifle spinning out of his hands. The creature was on top of him in an instant, its claws digging into his shoulders, its hot breath searing his face. It smelled like decay, like death itself. Jack kicked and struggled, using every ounce of strength to push the creature off him, but it was too strong, too fast. Its jaws snapped shut just inches from his face, the teeth sharp as daggers. His mind raced, and then, almost on instinct, he did it. He whistled. It was a reflex, a strange, stupid instinct that Jack had never been aware of until that moment, but as soon as the sound left his lips, the creature paused. For a split second, everything went still. And then the creature let out a sound that wasn't a growl but something else, something far worse. It was a voice. Low, raspy, as though the creature were speaking through the very darkness itself. "You shouldn't have done that." The words echoed in Jack's mind, sending a chill through his spine. He had heard legends of wolves in the Appalachian mountains, tales of shape-shifting beasts that preyed on those who wandered too far into the woods, but he had never believed them. Until now. The creature's eyes locked onto his, and Jack saw something in them, something that wasn't animal but human. A spark of intelligence, of malevolence, something ancient and terrifying. It spoke again, the words slithering through the air. "The whistle calls us, and now you belong to us." With a roar, the creature lunged again, but this time Jack was ready. He pulled a knife from his belt and slashed at the creature's chest. The blade sank into the thick, matted fur, but it wasn't enough. The creature swiped at him, sending Jack sprawling back, the pain searing through his side. Ben, finally snapping out of his paralysis, grabbed the rifle and fired a shot. The bullet struck the creature's shoulder, but it barely seemed to notice. It snarled, fur bristling, and swiped at Ben, knocking him to the ground. Jack knew they were outmatched. The creature was too strong, too fast, too powerful, and now it was toying with them. With no other choice, Jack did the only thing he could think of. He whistled again, louder this time. The creature froze, its head tilting in an unnatural angle. It stared at Jack, eyes burning with a deep, primal hunger. And then, as if making a decision, it stepped back, massive form blending back into the darkness. For a long moment, the woods were silent. "What the hell was that thing?" Ben gasped, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Jack said, his breath ragged. "But I don't think we're safe here. We need to leave." But even as Jack spoke, he knew it was too late. The creature had claimed the woods as its own, and now it would never let them go. The eyes in the pines. Maria had always been drawn to the quiet of the Appalachian wilderness. There was something about the land, something ancient that called to her deep in her soul. She had come to the farm in search of peace, a place to escape the noise of her past, away from the city and the reminders of the life she'd left behind. The farm, with its creaky wooden house and overgrown gardens, offered solitude in abundance. The towering pines in the yard surrounded her home like sentinels, and the breeze carried the scent of pine needles and earth. To most, it might have seemed lonely or desolate, but to Maria it was home. At first, the isolation felt comforting. She spent her days tending to the fields, growing vegetables, and caring for the few animals that remained on the farm. It was hard work, but satisfying. Every evening, after a long day of labor, Maria would sit on the porch of the old farmhouse, sipping tea as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in a warm amber glow. But as the days passed, Maria began to notice something strange. It started with the sound. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable over the normal night sounds of crickets and rustling leaves, but it was there. A faint whistle carried by the wind. It sounded almost like a bird, but it wasn't quite right. There was a haunting quality to it, something that didn't fit with the peaceful night air. At first, she brushed it off as her imagination, the product of too many long hours alone. But the whistling continued. Then came the eyes. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Maria had settled into her favorite rocking chair on the porch, her tired eyes scanning the stars that glittered above. The moon was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. The world felt still, too still. The usual sounds of the forest had all but vanished, replaced by an eerie quiet. And that's when she saw them. At first, they were just two tiny, distant lights, like the reflection of a car's headlights in the dark. But the longer she stared, the more they became distinct. Two sets of eyes glowing a deep, unsettling red, staring at her from the edge of the pine forest. They were at the base of the trees, just within the shadows, watching her intently. Maria's breath caught in her throat, her heart thudding loudly in her chest. The eyes didn't blink. They didn't move. They just stared. Maria stood up, her legs trembling beneath her. She grabbed the old lantern hanging on the porch and took a few steps forward, trying to get a better look. Her hands were unsteady, the lantern casting long, dancing shadows around her. She reached the edge of the yard where the pines loomed, their massive trunks reaching upward like dark sentinels. The eyes were still there, just beyond the tree line, glowing with an unnatural intensity. It felt as though they were drawing her in, pulling her toward the darkness. Her pulse quickened, but her feet moved of their own accord. She had to see what it was, had to understand. As she moved closer, the whistling sound began again, this time louder, clearer, like a soft, mournful tune being played just for her. It was coming from the trees, or maybe from the shadows between them. The wind had died down, and in its place the whistling was sharp, unnervingly clear. The air around her felt heavy, thick with something unseen. Maria's breath hitched as she reached the edge of the forest, the red eyes still locked onto her. She could now see that they were not the eyes of any animal she recognized. The glow was too intense, too vivid, and they were too high, at the height of a person or something taller. Her pulse raced as a sense of dread crawled up her spine. Then the whistling stopped. The air became thick with silence. A low growl emerged from the darkness, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through her bones. Maria froze. The growl wasn't like the sound of any animal she knew. It was more like a growl of something not entirely animal, something wrong, something that didn't belong. And then in the darkness, a figure stepped forward. It was tall, far too tall for any creature she had ever seen. Its shape was dark, blending into the shadows of the trees, but its eyes, those terrible red eyes, shone with an unnatural brilliance. It was humanoid in shape, but its movements were jerky, unnatural, as though its body wasn't quite in sync with the world around it. The figure seemed to glide, its limbs stretching unnaturally long, bending in ways that defied logic. Maria's heart pounded in her chest as the figure took another step forward. The eyes never left hers. A low whisper came from the darkness, like the sound of a voice that had been twisted by time. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, something ancient and malevolent. The creature stopped just at the edge of the light from the lantern, its eyes glowing brighter, casting an eerie reflection on the pine trees. For a long moment it simply stood there, watching her, as if it was waiting for something, waiting for her to make the next move. Maria's feet felt rooted to the ground, but she forced herself to take a step back. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though the darkness itself was closing in on her. Her body screamed at her to run, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the creature. Another step. And then it spoke. The voice was low, guttural, like the rasp of 1,000 whispered secrets. "Why did you call me?" Maria's breath caught in her throat. Her mouth went dry and she struggled to find words. I didn't," she stammered, but the words felt useless. The creature had no reason to believe her. She wasn't sure she believed herself. The figure took another step, and now Maria could make out more of its features. Its skin was pale, stretched tight across its bones. Its mouth was too wide, filled with jagged teeth that gleamed in the dim light. The hands, if they could even be called that, were long, spindly, ending in fingers that looked more like claws. The creature was no longer a shadow. It was real, and it was standing in front of her. "You shouldn't have come here," the creature whispered, its voice sending chills down her spine. "You've disturbed the peace of the woods. Now you will see what lies beneath the pines." With a sudden lurch, the creature lunged forward, its long limbs stretching out impossibly fast. Maria screamed, but before she could react, the figure was gone. It disappeared into the trees, vanishing into the night like smoke. The silence returned, but this time it was worse. The oppressive stillness hung in the air, suffocating her. She looked around, her heart pounding, but there was nothing, just the trees, the shadows, and the faintest sound of rustling leaves. And then she heard it again, the whistle. Closer now, almost as though it were circling her, taunting her. Maria spun around, her lantern casting frantic shadows, but there was nothing there. Her legs trembled as she backed away from the trees, heart racing. The eyes, those glowing red eyes, were still there, peering at her from the darkness, waiting. The woods had claimed her. She had been marked. And in the distance, the whispering voice carried on the wind, "You cannot leave the pines once you have seen us." Maria knew she was trapped. The eyes in the pines would watch her forever, and every night, the whistling would call her back into the woods, where the shadows of the past and the creatures that haunted them would never let her go. The shadow of the mountain. Ethan had never been one to believe in the supernatural. He was a man of logic, of reason, a seasoned detective who had spent years solving cases that ranged from the mundane to the sinister. The strange, the unexplained. They didn't belong in his world. But as he stood on the edge of the Appalachian mountains, staring at the dilapidated house before him, he had to admit that even his sharp instincts were struggling to make sense of the situation. The small town of Ashford was tucked deep into the mountains, a place that seemed almost forgotten by time. The people here lived simple lives, and to Ethan's surprise, they were reluctant to speak of the strange disappearances that had plagued the region for the last several months. The cases had started small, missing hikers, lost travelers, a few locals who hadn't returned home. But as the disappearances grew, so did the unease, and soon the town had started to whisper about things that shouldn't be possible. That was what had brought Ethan here. An investigation that had gone beyond the ordinary. When he had been called in, it wasn't just to find the missing. It was to find the truth, to uncover the dark secret that Ashford seemed to be hiding. His contacts in the town spoke of an old house up on the mountain, a house that was said to have been abandoned for years. But it had always been there, standing alone in the woods like a watchful sentinel. There were rumors about the house, whispers that it was somehow connected to the disappearances. Ethan wasn't sure what to believe, but he was determined to uncover the truth. The house was located at the end of a narrow, winding road that seemed to go on forever. As Ethan's truck bounced along the rough trail, the trees pressed in on either side, the canopy overhead growing thicker until only the faintest slivers of sunlight broke through. The mountainside was steep, the land rugged, and the air was dense with the smell of damp earth and decay. By the time Ethan reached the house, the sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the property. The house itself was a decaying relic from another time, its once white paint peeling and stained with age. The windows were boarded up, and the front door sagged on its hinges, like a mouth waiting to swallow him whole. There was an eerie stillness to the place, as if it had been waiting for him. Ethan stepped out of his truck, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots the only sound breaking the silence. He glanced around, taking in the overgrown yard and the forest that surrounded the house. The trees were thick here, their branches tangled like the webs of spiders, casting dark shadows across the ground. A shiver crawled up his spine, but he ignored it. He was a detective. He didn't get spooked by old houses or bad feelings. His flashlight illuminated the path as he approached the front door. As his hand reached for the rusted doorknob, a faint sound echoed in the air, a soft, melodic whistle. It was so faint at first that he almost thought he had imagined it, but it came again, clearer this time, carried on the wind. It wasn't the whistle of a bird or the wind itself. It was deliberate, purposeful. A warning. Ethan hesitated, his instincts telling him to turn back. But he was already here. He had to see this through. He pushed open the door, the wood creaking loudly as it swung on its broken hinges. The interior of the house was dark, cold, and smelled of rot. Dust and cobwebs covered the furniture, remnants of a life long forgotten. It was as if the house had been frozen in time, abandoned but not forgotten. He stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight. The air was heavy with the weight of the past, thick with the memories of those who had lived here. As he moved deeper into the house, the sound of whistling grew louder, as though someone, something, was following him. It was coming from the back of the house, from the darkness beyond the doorways. The whistling was soft, almost soothing, but there was an underlying tension to it, a sinister quality that made his skin crawl. "Hello," Ethan called, his voice echoing in the silence. "Is anyone here?" The whistling stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick and oppressive, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Ethan's heart began to race, but he steeled himself, refusing to show any sign of fear. He moved deeper into the house, his flashlight cutting through the darkness like a blade. The whistling started again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just a tune. It was a slow, haunting melody that sent a chill through his bones. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, like it was coming from inside his own head. He moved toward the back of the house, where the whistling seemed to be coming from. As he reached the doorway that led into a small room, he froze. There, standing in the shadows, was a figure. At first, it was difficult to make out, the dim light casting long, dark shapes across the room. But as Ethan stepped forward, the figure became clearer. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly arms that hung at its sides. The creature's face was hidden in the shadows, but Ethan could make out its glowing eyes, bright red, burning with an unnatural intensity. The whistling stopped. Ethan felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. He tried to speak, to call out, but his voice caught in his throat. His body was frozen, his feet rooted to the spot, as though the very air around him had turned to stone. The figure took a step forward, its movement jerky and unnatural. It was like watching a puppet on strings, its limbs contorting at odd angles. Its eyes, those terrible red eyes, never left him, and the sense of dread that washed over Ethan was overwhelming. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All he could do was watch. Then the figure spoke, its voice low, guttural, a rasping sound that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. "You shouldn't have come here." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the words echoed in his mind. The creature didn't move closer. Instead, it stood there, watching him, its glowing eyes never blinking. Ethan could feel the weight of its gaze like it was peering into his very soul. Without thinking, Ethan did the only thing he could think of. He raised his hand to his lips and whistled. The sound was sharp, clear, cutting through the air like a knife. He wasn't sure why he did it. Maybe it was out of desperation, or maybe it was some twisted instinct. But the moment the whistle left his lips, the creature recoiled. Its glowing eyes flashed brighter, and a deep, rumbling growl erupted from its throat. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping as if the house itself were freezing in response. For a brief moment, Ethan thought it was going to attack, but then the creature stopped. It tilted its head to the side as if considering him, and then with a slow, deliberate motion it stepped back into the shadows, disappearing from sight. Ethan stood there frozen, his heart still hammering in his chest. The house was silent again, the whistling gone, the creature gone. But the fear lingered, wrapping itself around his heart like a vice. He didn't know what he had just encountered, but he knew one thing for sure: the shadow of the mountain had marked him, and no matter how far he ran, no matter how far he traveled, it would follow him. As Ethan turned to leave, the whistling began again, faint at first, then growing louder. It was a warning, and it was coming for him. The whispering trees. Cole had always been the adventurous type, the kind of guy who thrived on the thrill of the unknown. So when his friends suggested a camping trip deep in the Appalachian mountains, he didn't hesitate. The idea of escaping the noise and stress of everyday life and immersing himself in the wilderness was just what he needed. A few days away from the world, surrounded by the towering trees and rugged terrain, seemed like the perfect way to reset. What he didn't realize, however, was that the Appalachian wilderness wasn't just a retreat from the world. It was a place where the world of the living and the dead coexisted, where the whispers of the past could still be heard in the rustling of the trees. The group had set up camp on a small clearing near a creek, the sound of the water gently flowing through the rocks providing a soothing background to their laughter and chatter. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. A fire crackled in the center of the camp, its warm glow flickering against the darkening sky. Cole, along with his friends, was enjoying the serenity of the moment, but something about the forest felt different tonight. It wasn't that the woods were inherently unsettling. It was more of a subtle, creeping sense of discomfort that he couldn't shake. "Hey, Cole," his friend Jake called out, holding up a bottle of whiskey. "Want a drink?" Cole shook his head with a grin. "Nah, not tonight. I'm just going to enjoy the fire. It's been a long week." "Suit yourself," Jake shrugged, taking a swig and passing the bottle around the circle. Everyone was laughing, talking, and telling stories, but Cole found himself distracted by something else. It wasn't the darkness or the chill in the air that made him uneasy. It was the silence of the forest. The usual sounds of wildlife, the chirping of crickets and the calls of birds were absent. Instead, there was a heavy, almost suffocating silence that seemed to hang in the air. It wasn't the kind of silence that comforted you. It was the kind that made you feel like something was watching. Despite the eerie atmosphere, Cole tried to shake off the feeling. He stood up and walked toward the edge of the clearing, taking a deep breath of the cool mountain air. He closed his eyes, listening to the faint rustle of the leaves in the breeze. That's when he heard it, a whisper. It was soft at first, like the wind carrying a distant voice. But then it came again, clearer this time. A soft, drawn-out sound that almost seemed to be calling his name. Cole froze, his heart skipping a beat. He looked around, But there was no one there, just the trees, their dark silhouettes stretching into the sky. "Cole," the whisper came again, only this time it wasn't the wind. It was distinct, deliberate. His pulse quickened. He turned to look back at the campfire, but no one seemed to notice. His friends were still talking and laughing, completely unaware of the strange sound that had frozen him in place. The wind. No, the air was still, and the sound had come from deeper within the woods. Feeling uneasy, Cole took a few steps toward the trees, moving further away from the warmth of the fire. The whispering grew louder, but it wasn't just a voice. It was a chorus. It was as if the trees themselves were speaking to him, calling out from every direction. Each whisper was like a thread weaving itself into the fabric of his mind, pulling him in, urging him forward. The trees around him seemed to sway unnaturally, their trunks twisting and turning, as though they were reaching toward him. He could hear the faint rustling of leaves, but the sound wasn't coming from the wind. It was coming from the trees themselves. A low, guttural whisper echoed from the thickest part of the forest. "Cole, come closer." His breath caught in his throat. He wanted to run, to turn back to the safety of his friends, but his legs wouldn't move. The whispers had taken root in his mind, and it was as if something was compelling him to follow them, to step deeper into the darkness of the woods. As if in a trance, Cole took another step, then another, his feet crunching on the undergrowth. He was no longer aware of the fire or his friends behind him. Everything had faded into the background, consumed by the call of the trees. The whispers seemed to surround him, growing louder with each step he took. They spoke in a language he couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. It was pleading, begging him to come closer, to step into the shadows where the trees grew thickest. And then, as if the forest itself had answered him, the whispers stopped. Cole froze, his breath caught in his throat. The silence was deafening, heavier than it had ever been before. He turned around, but the campfire was no longer visible. The clearing was gone, swallowed by the dark, towering pines. The trees had closed in around him, their branches twisting into strange, unnatural shapes that seemed to writhe and move on their own. The air grew colder, the chill seeping into his bones. Then he saw them. Eyes, red, glowing eyes peering out from the darkness between the trees. Dozens of them, hundreds of them, staring, unblinking, watching him. Their gaze was not like that of an animal. There was intelligence behind them, an ancient, malevolent intelligence. Cole's heart raced as the eyes began to move closer, their glowing light cutting through the darkness. The whispers returned, now urgent, frantic. "Come to us, come closer." Cole took a step back, his legs trembling beneath him. His breath came in shallow gasps as the eyes closed in on him, their unearthly glow intensifying with each passing second. The trees around him seemed to bend and shift, the trunks twisting in unnatural ways, their bark split and peeling, revealing dark, gaping holes where the whispers came from. Suddenly, a figure stepped from the shadows. It was tall, too tall, its limbs impossibly long and thin. Its face was obscured by a hooded cloak, but Cole could see the shape of its mouth, wide and gaping, stretching too far to be human. The figure stepped toward him, its feet making no sound as it moved through the underbrush. With every step it took, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were all he could hear. "Come closer, you belong to us now." The figure extended a hand, its fingers long and twisted, like branches reaching toward him. Cole's body screamed for him to run, but he was paralyzed, unable to tear his gaze away from the creature. The red eyes behind it glowed brighter, pulsing with an eerie rhythm. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches grabbing at his limbs, pulling him toward the figure. As the creature's hand reached out to touch his skin, the whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of voices that echoed through his mind, drowning out everything else. Suddenly, a flash of light broke through the darkness, a beam of light from a flashlight cutting through the trees. Cole's friends had found him. "Cole!" Jake's voice rang out, frantic and desperate. "Cole, what's happening?" The figure recoiled, its hand jerking back as though burned by the light. The red eyes disappeared, fading into the shadows, and the trees seemed to release their grip on him. The whispering stopped. Cole stumbled backward, his legs shaking, his body drenched in cold sweat. His friends rushed to him, pulling him away from the edge of the forest, away from the darkness that had consumed him. As they made their way back to the camp, the forest seemed to breathe again, the whispers fading into the night. But Cole knew. He knew that the trees were still out there, still watching, still waiting for the next soul to wander too far. The whispers would never leave him. They would follow him, beckoning him back into the woods, where the shadows and the eyes waited for him to come closer. And as they walked, the last whisper echoed in his mind, a chilling reminder of what he had heard. "You belong to us now." The creeping beast. Lily had always believed that nature held the answers to everything she sought. The chaos of the city, with its incessant noise and its restless pulse, had worn her thin. She longed for peace, for the quiet that could only be found deep in the Appalachian woods. So, she left behind the stress of her office job, the constant hum of technology, and the disconnection she felt from herself. She ventured alone into the forest, hoping to find something that would bring her the peace she so desperately needed. What she didn't expect was that the forest had its own kind of peace to offer, a peace that came at a cost. The Appalachian mountains were breathtaking, with towering trees and thick canopies that blocked out the sky, casting everything below into shadow. The forest was a labyrinth of paths, some well-trodden, others more elusive, hidden beneath a thick carpet of fallen leaves and moss. Lily found herself on one of these more obscure paths where only the bold dared to wander. She wasn't particularly experienced in hiking, but the solitude soothed her. The rhythmic crunch of her boots against the dirt was almost meditative. It gave her time to think, to reflect, to escape the weight of her past. The air was cool, crisp with the scent of pine and wet earth. A soft wind moved through the trees, making them sway gently, their branches creaking as though whispering to one another. Lily smiled to herself. The forest had a language, she was sure of it. It spoke in the rustling of leaves, in the songs of birds, in the crackling of distant branches. But as the hours passed, something changed. The air grew still, the sounds of the forest softening, as if the trees were holding their breath. A heavy silence settled over the landscape. Lily paused to take in the beauty of her surroundings. The sun was setting behind the distant mountains, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. She sat down on a moss-covered rock, looking out at the peaceful woods before her. As she did, her fingers absent-mindedly brushed against her lips, and before she could stop herself, she let out a soft whistle. It was almost instinctive, a tune she remembered from childhood, a song her grandmother used to hum. The sound broke the silence, a gentle melody that echoed through the trees, fading into the quiet wilderness around her. But as soon as the final note left her lips, something shifted. At first, it was subtle, a shift in the air, a rustling from behind her like something large moving through the underbrush. Lily froze, her heart skipping a beat. She turned her head slowly, her eyes scanning the shadows behind her. There was nothing there, just trees, the last remnants of sunlight slipping between their trunks. She shrugged off the unease, chalking it up to her imagination. It was a forest, after all, animals, birds, the usual sounds of wildlife, nothing to be afraid of. But then came the smell. At first it was faint, carried on the wind, a musky, earthy odor like wet fur and decay. It made her stomach churn, but she told herself it was just a scent from the forest, perhaps a rotting log or a patch of wet earth. But as the minutes passed, the smell grew stronger, more pungent, and it wasn't just the smell. It was the sound, too. A slow, dragging sound, like something large moving through the forest floor, its steps heavy and deliberate. Lily's breath caught in her throat. She stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. It was too quiet, too still. There was something wrong. She couldn't explain it, but her instincts screamed at her to leave, to run. But as she turned to go, she froze again. The rustling grew louder, and this time it wasn't coming from behind her. It was coming from all around her, from the trees, from the shadows. And then she saw it. At first it was just a shape, a dark, shifting form moving through the underbrush. But as it came closer, the details became clearer. It was massive, tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch far beyond what was normal. The creature's legs were long, too long, its body stretched and unnaturally thin, as though it didn't belong in the natural world. Its head was low to the ground, its eyes glowing a faint, unnatural red, watching her. But the worst part was its hands, or what could only be described as claws. They were long, curved, and glistened with something wet, like they had just emerged from a dark pool. Lily's breath caught in her throat, and before she could react, the creature lunged. It moved with a speed and grace that belied its monstrous form, its claws reaching for her, its body snapping forward in one fluid motion. Lily screamed and stumbled backward, her heart racing as she barely dodged its grasp. The creature's hot breath was on her neck, its growl vibrating through the air like a deep rumble in the earth. She bolted. Her legs were weak, but fear gave her strength as she sprinted through the trees, branches slapping at her face, roots tangling at her feet. She could hear it behind her, heavy, thudding steps, dragging across the ground, always just behind her. The woods that had once seemed peaceful and welcoming now felt like a maze of shadows, each tree a barrier between her and the creature chasing her. Her lungs burned, but she couldn't stop. She had to get away. Lily didn't know how far she ran. She didn't know if it had been minutes or hours. All she knew was that she couldn't stop, couldn't let the creature catch her. The whistle, her whistle, had drawn it to her, and now it was hunting her. She could hear it growling, that deep, rumbling sound that seemed to echo through the trees. The creature was toying with her, getting closer with each step, but never fully reaching her. It was as though it wanted her to keep running, to stay just out of reach, until the moment it would strike. Finally, exhausted and desperate, Lily stumbled into a clearing. Her chest heaved as she collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. The sounds of the creature's pursuit had stopped, but she could still feel its presence, like an invisible weight pressing down on her. She tried to calm her racing heart, to gather her thoughts, but there was no time. The woods were still, too still. And then in the silence she heard it, a whistle, low, haunting. It came from behind her, just outside the clearing. Lily's head whipped around, and there it was, standing at the edge of the trees, just out of reach of the moonlight. The creature, its eyes glowing in the darkness, watching her with that twisted, hungry stare. Its claws scraped against the ground, dragging as it stepped forward. The whistle came again, louder now, echoing through the trees. And this time it wasn't just a sound, it was a command. The creature was calling to her, drawing her closer, pulling her into its grasp. Lily's body screamed for her to run, but she couldn't move. Her legs were numb, her mind clouded with fear. The creature was waiting, and it wasn't going to stop until it had her. And then, as if in a final act of defiance, Lily did the only thing she could think to do. She whistled. It wasn't a tune or a melody, but a sharp, clear sound that pierced the air like a challenge. The creature paused, its head tilted, and for a moment there was silence. The whistle had caught it off guard. For a second it didn't know how to react. But then the creature let out a low growl, a sound of anger and frustration. It was as if the whistle had triggered something in it, a response that it couldn't ignore. Its eyes blazed brighter and it lunged. Lily didn't have time to think. She ran faster than she'd ever run before, the sound of the creature's growls filling her ears as she pushed through the underbrush. Her body was nearly broken, but her will to survive was stronger. She didn't stop. She couldn't stop. And as the trees closed in around her, she realized that no matter how far she ran, the woods would never let her go. The creature had marked her, and the Appalachian wilderness was now her prison, a place where every whisper of the wind, every creak of the trees, reminded her that she was never truly alone. She would never escape the creature in the dark, and it would never stop hunting her. The whistle would always be there, waiting. The ghost of Hollow Hill. David had always been fascinated by the supernatural. It was the things that couldn't be explained, the mysteries that lingered at the edges of reality, that intrigued him the most. As a researcher in paranormal phenomena, he had traveled the world, investigating haunted locations, speaking to witnesses, and documenting the unexplained. But there was one place that had always drawn his curiosity more than any other: Hollow Hill. Located in the quiet, sleepy town of Ashbourne, Hollow Hill was a place steeped in dark history, a place that most people avoided, whether out of superstition or fear. The locals knew the stories well, but they rarely spoke about them. There were whispers of the hill's cursed past, of an ancient massacre that had taken place centuries ago. It was said that the spirits of those who had perished in the bloodshed still haunted the hill, their restless souls trapped in the very earth where they had died. David had read about the massacre. The year was 1734, and a group of settlers had been slaughtered by an unknown force. Theories ranged from an attack by Native American tribes to something more sinister, a group of rogue soldiers, or perhaps even a dark cult. No one knew for sure, but the fact remained that the massacre had been brutal, and no one from that time had ever spoken of it again. The dead had been buried hastily, their names lost to history, and Hollow Hill had become a place of sorrow, violence, and mystery. David's fascination with the hill had led him here, to Ashbourne, with one goal in mind: to uncover the truth. He had heard the whispers about the ghosts of Hollow Hill and their restless souls, and now he was determined to document them. Armed with his equipment, a voice recorder, an EMF detector, and a camera, David set out to explore the hill at night, hoping to capture evidence of the paranormal that had long been rumored. The air was cold when David arrived at the base of Hollow Hill, the ground slick with frost from the crisp autumn air. The hill rose sharply before him, its peak hidden by the heavy canopy of trees. The darkness was thick, oppressive, as though the shadows themselves were trying to swallow him whole. David's flashlight beam barely cut through the dense fog that clung to the ground like a blanket. He took a deep breath and began to climb, the crunch of dead leaves beneath his boots the only sound in the otherwise silent night. His heart beat faster with each step, not from fear but from excitement, the anticipation of what he might discover. The hill was steep, and it wasn't long before David found himself winded, the cold air biting at his lungs. As he ascended, the forest around him seemed to grow quieter, the usual sounds of nocturnal animals eerily absent. The fog thickened, and the moon, barely visible through the swirling mist, cast an eerie light over the landscape. It felt as though the very earth beneath his feet was alive, watching him, waiting. David reached the summit of the hill after what felt like an eternity. The ground was uneven, littered with rocks and twisted roots, but he didn't care. He was here, at the heart of the mystery, the place where the massacre had occurred. He knelt down, setting his equipment carefully on the ground. His heart raced as he began to set up his recorder, the anticipation mounting with every passing second. "Is there anyone here?" David asked aloud, his voice carrying into the night. "I'm here to listen. Please speak to me." For a moment there was nothing, just the oppressive silence of the hill. But then, faintly at first, a sound began to drift on the wind. It was soft at first, like a whisper carried through the trees. David leaned in, his breath catching in his throat. The sound grew clearer, more distinct. It was a whistle. At first, David thought it was just the wind, but it wasn't. The whistle was too deliberate, too controlled. It was the unmistakable sound of someone or something calling out to him. David's heart skipped a beat as the whistle echoed through the trees. It was almost haunting, like a lullaby from the past, a sound from a time long gone. He stood up, his equipment still running, and glanced around, trying to pinpoint the source of the whistle. But there was nothing, no movement in the trees, no figure in the mist. Just the faint echo of the whistle, like a distant memory. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves, and then almost instinctively he whistled back. The sound hung in the air for a moment, and then it came again, closer this time. A low, mournful whistle, as though it were beckoning him. David's pulse quickened. He was alone, or so he thought. Before he could react, the wind shifted and the temperature dropped sharply. His breath clouded in front of him as the chill wrapped itself around his bones. The ground beneath his feet trembled just slightly, as though something heavy was moving beneath the earth. Then from the darkness he saw it. A flicker of movement, too quick to be a person, too fluid to be a shadow. A figure emerged from the fog. It was tall, its body shrouded in a cloak of mist and darkness. The figure's movements were slow, deliberate, as though it was walking toward him, through the very fog that surrounded them. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but David could see the faint outline of something in its hands, an object glinting in the moonlight. A weapon, a symbol, he couldn't tell, but the figure seemed to glide toward him without ever stepping on the ground. "Who are you?" David called out, his voice trembling despite himself. "What do you want?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it stepped closer, its presence overwhelming, suffocating the air around them. David felt his stomach drop as the temperature continued to plummet. The fog swirled around his feet, rising up in thick tendrils that seemed to reach for him. Then, suddenly, the whispering began. It was low at first, almost imperceptible, but then it grew louder, filling the air around him. The whispers were a mix of voices, disjointed and fragmented, like the broken echoes of 1,000 souls trapped in the mist. Some of the voices were frantic, others were mournful, but they all spoke with the same desperation, pleading for release, for peace, for something that David couldn't understand. "Help us," one voice rasped, barely more than a breath. "We are lost." David's heart hammered in his chest as the whispers grew louder, circling around him like a storm. He looked around, trying to make sense of it, but the figure remained motionless, its eyes hidden beneath the cloak. There was no escape from the whispers, no way to stop the flood of voices that seemed to drown out everything else. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispers stopped. The figure in the fog took another step forward, its glowing eyes now visible beneath the hood. They were a deep, unnatural red, fierce, like embers burning in the dark. And then, with an almost imperceptible movement, the figure reached out and raised its hand as if beckoning him forward. David's body froze. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. He was trapped in the gaze of those eyes, locked in their fiery grip. But just as he felt himself being drawn in, something snapped him back to reality. The air around him seemed to shudder, the whispers returning, more frantic now. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, David turned and ran. He didn't look back. His breath came in ragged gasps, his feet pounding the ground, his heart thundering in his chest. The fog seemed to close in around him as he ran, the whispers and the figure trailing behind him like shadows. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of Hollow Hill, where the forest opened up and the sound of the creek rushing through the valley filled his ears. But even as he caught his breath, the chilling whistle echoed in the distance, followed by the low growl of something far worse. The shadows of the hill had followed him, and they would never let him go. The howling in the wind. Tom had always craved adventure. It was in his blood, the thrill of the unknown, the rush of exploring the unexplored. The Appalachian Mountains had been a dream of his for years. There was something about the rugged terrain, the deep forests, and the jagged peaks that called to him like a siren's song. He had grown up hearing stories of the mountains, of strange occurrences and things that no one could quite explain, but to Tom they were just that, stories, myths and legends, nothing more. He had set out alone on this trip, wanting to escape the daily grind of city life and immerse himself in the wild. Armed with his backpack, camping gear, and an unshakable sense of confidence, Tom began his hike up the mountain. The air was crisp, the leaves rustling in the wind as he made his way deeper into the dense forest. The trees were tall, their trunks thick and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The further Tom walked, the more isolated he felt. There was no sign of civilization, no distant hum of traffic or the buzz of electricity. Just him and the mountains. It was everything he had hoped for, until it wasn't. The first night was peaceful enough. He found a small clearing by a creek, set up his tent, and settled in for a night under the stars. The wind howled through the trees, but it was the kind of sound that felt natural, a part of the world around him. There was no sense of danger, no foreboding. Everything felt right. But as he lay in his sleeping bag, drifting into a restless sleep, something shifted in the air. The wind that had been so soothing before now felt different, darker, colder. It was as though the forest had become alive, holding its breath, waiting for something. Tom couldn't explain it, but something in the air made him uneasy. The howling wind outside seemed to carry with it a strange energy, something that was too unsettling to ignore. Then he heard it. A soft, almost melodic whistle cutting through the howling wind. At first he thought it was just his imagination, the wind playing tricks on him. But the whistle came again, closer this time, clearer. It wasn't the kind of whistle that could be made by an animal or the wind. It was too deliberate, too structured, like someone or something was calling out to him. Tom sat up, his heart pounding in his chest. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside the tent, scanning the dark forest around him. The whistle had stopped, but the silence that followed felt wrong. It was thick, oppressive, as though the forest was holding its breath. He stepped forward, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air had grown colder, the wind now silent, and the forest around him felt unnaturally still. Then out of the corner of his eye he saw it, a shadow moving just at the edge of the trees, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. "Hello," Tom called out, his voice trembling slightly despite his attempt to sound calm. "Is anyone out there?" There was no answer, just the deep silence of the night. His nerves began to fray, but Tom wasn't the type to back down. He turned the flashlight off to save the battery and walked a little further, hoping to find the source of the strange sound. The shadows seemed to stretch further with each step he took, the trees closing in around him like silent sentinels. Then he heard the whistle again, but this time it wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from above him. Tom's heart skipped a beat. He looked up at the sky, but all he could see was the canopy of trees and the faint outline of stars. The whistle came again, sharp, chilling, echoing through the mountains like a wailing cry. And then it came, the sound of something else. A howl. Deep and guttural, the kind of howl that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It echoed across the mountain, reverberating through the trees, sending a chill through Tom's bones. It wasn't the cry of a wolf nor a coyote. It was something darker, more primal. Panic surged through him as the howling grew louder, more frantic, coming from every direction at once. The sound of multiple creatures, each one howling in unison, their voices rising and falling in a haunting chorus. Tom's breath caught in his throat and his body froze. The whistle returned, this time accompanied by a low, shrieking sound like the wind itself had turned against him. Tom's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot. He glanced around frantically, trying to find the source of the sounds, but the shadows around him only deepened. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay, the very atmosphere charged with an energy he couldn't explain. He took a step back, and that's when he saw them. Eyes, hundreds of them, all glowing a fierce yellow, watching him from the darkness of the forest. The creatures, no, the monsters, were hidden just beyond the trees, their eyes the only part of them visible in the dim light. The glow was too bright to be natural, too intense to be anything other than unnatural. The howls reached a crescendo, a chorus of monstrous voices rising in unison, and then through the trees they emerged. The creatures were like nothing Tom had ever seen. Their bodies were large and covered in matted fur, their limbs long and twisted, ending in claws that scraped the ground with a sickening screech. Their faces were a grotesque combination of man and beast, with sharp, elongated teeth bared in an animalistic snarl. The creatures moved toward him, their eyes never leaving his, the whistle now turning into a low, vibrating hum that resonated in the very air. Tom's heart raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. He turned to run, but his legs felt weak, his feet tangled in the underbrush. The creatures were closing in, moving with terrifying speed and precision. The howl of one creature was joined by another, and then another, until the sound seemed to surround him completely. He couldn't see the path back to camp. The trees had shifted, the forest becoming a maze of shadows. The creatures were closing in. They were everywhere, surrounding him, stalking him, drawn to the sound of his whistle. Tom managed to break free, stumbling through the underbrush, the howls growing louder with each step he took. His breath came in ragged gasps, his mind spinning with fear and adrenaline. He couldn't see the creatures anymore, but he could feel them. The air was thick with their presence, the weight of their gaze pressing down on him. Finally, he reached the edge of the clearing where his camp was, his legs shaking from exhaustion. He collapsed to the ground, panting, eyes darting around the camp, searching for any sign of the creatures. But they were gone. The forest was silent again, the eerie howling now only a distant echo. Tom's heart was still racing, his body trembling, but the creatures were no longer there. The wind had picked up again, blowing through the trees, but it was different now, lighter, almost normal. The tension in the air had lifted, but the fear in Tom's chest remained. He didn't understand what had just happened. The creatures, the howls, the whistle, it was all too much. He had stumbled into something in the woods, something ancient, something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. Tom didn't sleep that night. His mind was too consumed with the sounds of the creatures, the echoing whistle that still seemed to ring in his ears, the eerie glow of their eyes that haunted him even in the light of day. He packed his things and left the next morning without a word to his friends, without a word to anyone. As he made his way back down the mountain, the whistle came again. Faint, soft, and in the distance he could hear the howling, the curse of the Appalachian. Rachel had always been the adventurous type, the kind of person who saw life as a series of experiences waiting to be had. When she and her husband, Mark, decided to take a family trip to the Appalachian Mountains, she didn't think much of it. After all, the trip was meant to be a bonding experience for their family, a time to escape the pressures of the city and reconnect with nature. Little did they know, this trip would lead them into a nightmare they would never escape. The small cabin they rented was tucked deep into the heart of the Appalachian wilderness. It was rustic and charming, nestled at the edge of a dense forest that stretched for miles. The kind of place people came to in search of peace and quiet. It was the perfect escape from their busy lives, or so they thought. The mountains, with their towering trees and winding trails, seemed to hold a certain kind of magic, a magic Rachel was eager to experience. She could feel the weight of the city lifting as they made their way up the mountain road, the air growing fresher, the landscape more serene with every passing mile. The first 2 days of their stay were perfect. Mark and Rachel spent their days hiking through the forest, exploring the trails and taking in the breathtaking views. Their children, Mia and Jake, loved it. They ran through the woods, played by the stream, and reveled in the freedom that the isolation of the mountain offered. At night, they gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories under a sky filled with stars. But as the third night fell, a change settled over the land. The weather turned suddenly, and the once clear skies became clouded, a heavy mist descending over the mountain. Rachel couldn't explain it, but the air felt different. It felt heavier, charged with an eerie energy. The birds were silent, and the wind, which had been gentle during the day, now howled through the trees, carrying a strange, haunting whistle that seemed to come from deep within the forest. Mark suggested they stay inside that night, given the strange weather, and they all agreed. The kids went to bed early, exhausted from their day's activities, and Mark and Rachel settled into the living room with a bottle of wine. It was quiet, too quiet. The wind outside howled against the walls of the cabin, but inside, everything seemed still. Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She tried to brush it off, but the uneasy sense that something was watching her lingered. She excused herself to step outside for a moment, wanting to clear her head. Mark gave her a concerned look but said nothing, and she stepped out onto the porch, the wooden floor creaking beneath her feet. The moment she stepped outside, the temperature dropped. The air was thick, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, and the mist seemed to swirl around her, making it difficult to see. The sound of the wind was deafening, but through it she heard something else, faint at first, like a melody carried on the breeze. A whistle. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was deliberate, sharp, and eerily familiar. She paused, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. The sound came again, this time louder, clearer, like someone was standing just beyond the edge of the porch, calling to her. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Is someone there?" But there was no answer, only the soft, melodic whistle that seemed to echo from the woods. She took a few cautious steps toward the edge of the porch, peering into the darkness, trying to see where the sound was coming from. The mist had thickened, swirling like a living thing, and the trees loomed like dark sentinels in the night. The whistle came again, and Rachel felt a strange pull toward it. A compulsion, deep in her chest, urging her to move toward the sound. She stepped off the porch, her boots crunching on the gravel as she moved forward. With each step, the whistle grew louder and the air around her grew colder. "Rachel, don't!" Mark's voice suddenly called from inside the cabin. "Come back inside." But it was too late. Rachel didn't hear him anymore. The whistle was too loud, too insistent. It called to her, beckoning her deeper into the mist. She walked into the woods, her legs moving of their own accord. The trees seemed to part before her, guiding her forward. The wind howled around her and the mist thickened, but the path ahead remained clear. It was as if the forest was leading her somewhere, somewhere she didn't want to go. As she walked deeper into the woods, she began to hear other sounds, low, guttural growls that seemed to echo from the shadows. The whistle had stopped, but the air was charged with something else now, something darker. The woods had become alive, and the air hummed with an energy that made her skin crawl. And then she saw them. At first, it was just a flicker in the corner of her eye, but as she turned, she saw them, figures moving in the mist, barely visible but unmistakable. They were tall, cloaked in tattered, dark garments, their faces obscured by the shadows. But their eyes, those eyes were the only thing she could see clearly. Red, glowing, burning like embers in the dark. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest, and her breath caught in her throat. She tried to scream, but the sound was caught in her chest, choking her. The figures began to move closer, their long, thin limbs gliding through the mist. Their heads turned, the red eyes locking onto her with a gaze that sent ice through her veins. Then the growls came again, louder now, rising in intensity as the figures closed in on her. They were no longer just watching her. They were moving, coming toward her with purpose, their presence suffocating the air. Rachel stumbled backward, but it was no use. She had stepped too far into their domain. "Mom, Mom!" The frantic voices of Mia and Jake suddenly pierced the air, echoing from behind her. But the figures were closing in, their movements swift and predatory. Rachel turned, her heart in her throat as she rushed back toward the cabin, the growls and whispers growing louder with each step. The mist thickened, and the shadows seemed to chase her, but every step she took brought her no closer to safety. The door to the cabin was just ahead, but as she reached it, the figures appeared in front of her, blocking the way. She tried to scream, to call out to her family, but the words wouldn't come. The figures raised their hands, their long fingers twisting into claws, and the air around her became thick with their presence, their cold, malevolent energy pressing in on her from all sides. "You disturbed us. Now you will stay with us forever." The words were not spoken. They were felt, like a shudder deep in her bones, a force that crushed her from the inside out. Rachel tried to reach for the door to escape, but the shadows swarmed around her, pulling her back. The cold, dark hands of the figures wrapped around her, and she could hear the distant wail of her children's cries fading into the wind. And then, in that moment of darkness, the world shifted. The air grew heavier, the pressure in her chest unbearable. The whispers, the growls, and the howling winds filled her ears as the world around her blurred and faded into nothingness. Rachel awoke with a start, gasping for breath, her heart pounding in her chest. But the cabin was still, too still. She was in her bed, the familiar surroundings of the cabin around her. Her family was there too, safe and sound. But something was wrong. She could feel it. The weight of the curse that had taken hold of them, the pull of the shadowy figures still lingering in the corners of her mind. The whistle came again, soft, distant, but unmistakable, and in the distance she heard the howling wind once more. It would never end. The curse of the Appalachian wilderness had claimed them, and they would never escape. The stories of the Appalachian Mountains are steeped in dark mysteries and supernatural forces that have haunted the land for centuries. From the chilling whispers of Hollow Hill to the terrifying encounters with the Whistling Man, the creatures lurking in the forest seem to transcend the boundaries of the natural world. These tales serve as a reminder of the deep connection between the living and the dead, and how the past never truly fades away. In each story, whether it be a ghostly encounter, a monstrous creature stalking its prey, or the sinister influence of an ancient curse, we are reminded that the forces of darkness and the unknown often dwell just beyond our understanding. What is most unsettling about these stories is the way in which they tap into our primal fears, the fear of the unknown, the fear of being watched, and the fear of being powerless against forces beyond our control. The whistle that lures people into the woods, the glowing red eyes of creatures that exist in the shadows, and the eerie presence of ghosts that never rest. These elements create a sense of unease and vulnerability that resonates with us all. These stories challenge our beliefs, our courage, and our sense of safety, urging us to confront our deepest fears. Through each tale, there is a constant theme: the importance of respect for the unknown, the need to acknowledge that there are things in this world beyond our comprehension. Whether it's the natural world or the supernatural, there are forces at play that we may never fully understand. These stories remind us that we must tread carefully, that curiosity can lead us into dangerous places, and that the things we seek to escape from may be the very things that chase us down when we least expect it. The deeper lesson in these stories is one of balance and respect. It's a reminder to approach life with humility and awareness of the forces beyond our understanding. In our daily lives, we often push boundaries, seeking answers to questions that may be better left unanswered. We may take risks, wander into uncharted territories, and seek thrills in places we don't fully understand. But as these tales show, there are consequences when we disturb what should be left alone. In our modern world, we face the same kind of temptation, whether it's pushing our limits in relationships, work, or our personal lives. There's often a sense of invincibility, the belief that we can handle anything that comes our way. But sometimes, like the characters in these stories, we find ourselves in situations where we are out of our depth, facing challenges that we cannot control. The lesson here is to respect boundaries, listen to our instincts, and understand when it's time to turn back before we go too far. Just as the characters in these stories learn the hard way, we must also learn to balance curiosity with caution, action with reflection, and ambition with wisdom. It's important to listen to the signs around us, trust our inner voice, and know that not every mystery is ours to solve. What do you think about the stories of the Appalachian Mountains and the lessons they hold? Do you believe there are things in this world that we should be wary of? Or do you think curiosity is always worth the risk? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Let's engage in a discussion and learn from each other's perspectives. We'd love to hear your opinions. If you enjoyed this video and want to support our channel, make sure to subscribe for more thrilling, thought-provoking content like this. Your support keeps us going and motivates us to create more exciting stories and insights for you. Let's continue this journey together.